All right, let's dive right in. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to unpack a pretty mind-blowing chain of events. It's a story about how controlling, well, literally dirt, somehow led to controlling the future of global technology. If you really want to understand today's geopolitical landscape, you actually have to start by looking right at the ground beneath our feet. To wrap our heads around this massive macroeconomic shift, let's just think about something physical, an everyday object. Like, how does a tiny little magnet defy gravity to hold a heavy steel knife up on your kitchen wall? We've all seen those magnetic knife holders, right? Well, you absolutely couldn't do that with those old, clunky ferrite magnets we used a few decades ago. The secret is actually an invisible, incredibly powerful force made possible by a highly specific group of elements. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with the super magnet revolution, see how the West outsourced the dirty work, track China's climb up the value chain, look at the green tech checkmate, the fallout in the de-industrialized West, and finally, a brand new ideological clash. All right, let's get this chain reaction started.
Part 1. The Super Magnet Revolution.
You know, before we could even dream of having smartphones in our pockets or electric vehicles on the road, there had to be this massive leap in miniaturization. And the sheer scale of this upgrade? It's just wild. Developed back in 1983, rare earth magnets are literally 100 times smaller than traditional ferrite magnets at the exact same strength. It's a pure marvel of technology. It's the whole reason modern gadgets can be small and light. It allowed electric engines to become compact and super efficient, which, physically speaking, kick-started the entire digital and green mobility revolution. Moving on to Part 2, outsourcing the dirty work. Let's rewind to the 1980s and 90s. Japan and the West held all the valuable patents, but they were about to walk right into a really alluring trap. The industrial dynamic back then was pretty stark. On one side, you had Japan and Western nations heavily prioritizing high-tech profit margins, pushing hard toward a service economy. On the other side, China was offering incredibly cheap labor to handle the low-tech and, frankly, highly toxic machining and refining. The West fell into what our source material calls wishful thinking. They basically figured they could just hold on to the high-value intellectual property forever, all while shipping the messy, dangerous refining work overseas to bump up their margins. There's this quote from an Australian consultant in the source material that hits the nail on the head. He says, "The Chinese said, 'Come to Canton, relocate your low-value, rare earth applications, and we'll take care of your low-tech.' And honestly, the allure was just too great." Giant companies like France's Rhône-Poulenc and Japan's Hitachi were totally enticed by those rock-bottom costs. So by chasing cheap production, they knowingly handed over the entire foundational refining ecosystem, the whole shebang. Which brings us to Part 3, climbing the value chain. By the early 2000s, a strategic pivot happened. China decided it didn't just want to be a supplier of raw dirt anymore. It wanted a serious piece of the high-tech pie. And here is how they pulled it off. Step 1. Institute mineral export quotas. Step 2. This predictably created an artificial global resource shortage, leading to severe price distortion on the international market. Step 3. Offer abundant, cheap resources, but exclusively to foreign factories that were willing to physically relocate their operations into China. It was a strict technology versus resource trade-off. Foreign magnet makers were facing a dry spell of raw materials and were essentially forced to move their factories and share their tech just to survive.
If we map this out, the evolution was blindingly fast. In the 1980s, the focus was purely on raw mining. Come the 1990s, low-end refineries in China had fully caught up to and matched Western tech. By the 2000s, that quota strategy I just mentioned forced the actual relocation of magnet manufacturing. And today, it's a fully integrated green tech downstream industry. It went from pulling raw dirt to manufacturing finished, high-tech products in just a few decades.
To really visualize what this looks like on the ground, look at the city of Baotou in Inner Mongolia. It's now known as the Silicon Valley of Rare Earths. We are talking about a glittering, neon-lit metropolis that hosts over 3,000 companies, generates 4.5 billion euros every single year, and single-handedly pumps out a third of all global rare earth magnets. It is literally a victorious city built entirely on climbing that value chain.
And you better believe the rest of the world was taking notes. China's success sparked this huge global ripple effect of financial nationalism. Take Indonesia, they actually banned raw tin exports in 2014, specifically to force the creation of a downstream industry. They even set up the ICDX to fix prices locally, totally defying the traditional London metal exchange. Meanwhile, over in Africa, we're seeing the development of local phosphate processing industries. The goal there is exactly the same. Retain that added value locally, rather than just shipping out the raw rock.
All right, part 4, the green tech checkmate.
So all of this acquired knowledge was eventually aimed right at the most lucrative industry of the 21st century. The big driver here is a policy called indigenous innovation. It's a state strategy of absorbing, reworking, and internalizing imported technologies, often grabbed through those forced joint ventures we talked about, all to cultivate domestic scientific supremacy. Fueled by massive state plans like Made in China 2025 and Program 863, this allowed them to transition from just being the world's factory to becoming the world's laboratory. If you want a single metric to show how successful that factory to laboratory shift has been, just look at this number. 1.4 million. That is the staggering amount of patents China filed in 2018 alone. It's a complete paradigm shift. They are no longer a consumer of skills, guys. They are the primary supplier.
And here is what that looks like in practice. According to our source material, they became the global leader in green energy generation, the #1 manufacturer of photovoltaic systems, the biggest investor in wind power, and were projected to produce 80 to 90% of all electric vehicle batteries by 2020. This technological checkmate positions them as the undisputed economic winner of the global energy and digital transition. Which leads us to Part 5, the de-industrialized West.
Of course, every action has a reaction, right? To grasp the macroeconomic fallout of this shift, take a look at this massive number, $4 trillion. According to a researcher cited in our source, that's the estimated wealth transfer from the rest of the world to China in the high-tech equipment manufacturing sector alone. Losing that downstream supply chain, the batteries, the sensors, all those assembled parts, it represents a truly colossal financial shift.
And behind that crazy number is a very real, very heavy human element. There's this quote from Jim Robinson, a U.S. trade unionist in Gary, Indiana. He said, "The region was so industrialized that it was called the American Ruhr. No one could have imagined what we were in for." We're talking about hollowed-out, abandoned neighborhoods in the American Rust Belt and the loss of 900,000 industrial jobs in France alone over a 15-year period. The global quest for green jobs completely restructured who works where. Finally, Part 6, a new ideological clash. These new economic realities have directly fueled a fundamental clash of global worldviews. It's fascinating how this economic shift actually validates different political models. For a long time, the Washington Consensus argued that economic growth and democratic progress are, necessarily tied together. But on the flip side, the Beijing Consensus argues that a state-directed, authoritarian capitalist approach can provide incredibly robust growth and long-term political stability. As our sources point out, winning the battle for green jobs in high-tech manufacturing has really validated this long-term, state-directed vision in the eyes of a lot of emerging nations.
Now, the narrative presented to the rest of the world is often one of cooperation. Take the concept of Tian-sha, which is inspired by Confucius. It promotes the search for harmony and deep interdependence in international relations, essentially favoring a world without conflict. Chinese philosophers promote this peaceful future, kind of mirroring the sentiment of their famous panda diplomacy. But at the exact same time, the aggressive state-backed acquisition of strategic international companies and the monopolization of critical supply chains, that tells a much more complex and highly competitive story.
Which really just leaves us with this final, crucial question to chew on. Is it possible for the world to achieve a green energy transition without fundamentally surrendering global industrial and ideological power? Because, as we've seen today, controlling the raw materials, that was just step one. Controlling the technology was the ultimate goal all along. Anyway, I hope this explainer helped you grasp the incredible geopolitical stakes hiding inside the everyday technology we take for granted. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning how our world really works.